with business and vacations and some other things going on. We are happy to be back here with you live on YouTube. And of course, always like, subscribe, and share, and check out our ebooks online from Dr. Patino. I think that'd be worth a watch. And of course, his blog at what is it?
It's a medium.com.
Medium.com. Yep. It's
Yeah.
actually on the thing below us, described at blog.p at medium.com. Anyway, welcome back, Doctor. I know you've had some interesting times, and tonight we're going to be discussing an interesting topic, and that is whiteness a curse? What
you know, for
that
for for somebody like you and me who are kind of white but Hispanic to some degree and European, but also for me Mexican, you Dominican Republic. I mean, it is kind of like a tightrope to
Yeah.
walk, right? For us personally. But it's a topic that has been in my mind for a while, and you and I kind of worked together on putting this blog about whiteness, and I'm actually working on a book about it um, because psychologically speaking and psychiatrically speaking, I'm always been interested on the meaning. What is the purpose of whiteness? What does it mean? Is it just the color of your skin, or is it your personal identity, or is it a cult, right? And that at different levels have different values, and the cultural underpinnings of whiteness are very complex. It's not as simple as, I remember when I first came to the United States, and well, I've been in the United States all my life, but in and out, when I came back in the 1980s, I found it really fascinating um, to find ideas about the United States that were very different. I remember the phrase WASP, right? And that was the white Anglo-Saxon
Jackson Protestant.
Protestant male, right? That was kind of like the model of whiteness at the time. And I don't think it's changed a lot. I think that the culture has um, removed some of the features of that and is taking it into the whole culture. But there's still a small percentage of cultish people in that environment. And the last writing about it was about how, for some people, whiteness is all they have,
Mm.
especially in the most recent political environment. When I've always wondered, why is it that white poor people, okay, are willing to sacrifice themselves for whiteness, right? For the cult. And it's kind of hard for me to understand the being stuck on all I need is to be white.
Well, I think it was Lyndon Johnson, and if I remember correctly, who said that true racism, if you were to boil it down, is when the best of theirs is still lower than the worst of ours.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what that is, right? I'm a poor, or back in the day, crop sharing, white person, but I'm still better than someone else. It gives them a sense of value, I think, and belonging, that racism above their socioeconomic situation.
Yeah, but you see, in a society that is being kind of selectively inclusive, and that comes from your wording, not necessarily mine, um, there's always the risk of white people becoming the minority, right?
Mm,
And when your whiteness is being threatened by a lot of different cultures, whether it's culture or religion, um, then your only option is to fight. But then I have to wonder, what are you fighting for,
yeah.
right? Is it just the whiteness? Um, and we get into the white supremacist movements that have been around forever, right? I mean, this is not the white supremacy is not a American phenomenon. It's an important phenomenon. Spain and Italy and France have slaves probably before the United States. The Romans had slaves, for God's sakes, and some of them came from Africa too. So this whole economic movement of slavery is not necessarily just a reflection of the United States, but it forces people into the us versus them, right? And then the assumption that whiteness gives you an intellectual value that you may not have,
Mm.
right?
We forget too that there was a time where the people we consider white, to a certain extent, European immigrants, weren't considered white when they were immigrating. The Irish, hey, they're about as white as you can get. Certain people, it was really just that white Anglo-Saxon from England. Everybody
Mhm.
else was considered something else, even though the color of their skin. How did that, white-skinned immigrants who were not considered white, even though they were, uh, Germany, all these other places, when did that meld into this American whiteness that the white supremacists have now grabbed onto so vehemently?
I think that there is a combination, and we're focusing primarily on whiteness, but we cannot eliminate the influence of whiteness and religion combined, right? That's why the WASP phrase, in terms of it wasn't just white and it wasn't just Anglo-Saxon, but was also Protestant, right? Because there was also a time when Catholics were considered, you know, bad.
Yep.
I mean, it wasn't until I think President Kennedy in the
Kennedy.
early 1960s we had a Catholic president in the United States, and there's a reason for that, right? So we have race, and then we have religion combined. That I think is kind of the worst kind of cult, right? Because it's a double-edged sword, and you have two different issues that at the same time are creating a sense of identity, right? So anybody who is not white and is not Protestant, Christian, is different, and he has to be rejected, right?
And so you think it's an insecurity of that again, of that going away, the white controlling factors or ruling class, whatever you want to call it, feeling threatened? Because I think I told you this. I had a very interesting talk with a friend of mine, former NFL football player, and I was shocked. He was like, white males like us, and I was like, oh, okay, interesting. Hold on. First off, not 100% there, but white males like us are under assault. And he's like, don't you see that? And I said, I have not experienced that personally at all. I have not. But he really, I could tell he really thought they were under assault. So it was important to fight back, as you say. And I find that odd because I'm like, I wanted to ask him, I said, how are you assaulted? How are you prejudiced? What has happened to your life that has changed you so much that you feel have to fight back? Or is this just a perception of them losing their group identity?
Well, you see, I I cannot eliminate the idea of whiteness without analyzing me, right? I mean, in, in, I'm far from pure white, right? And I'm far from being Protestant, right? But my grandfather was British,
Hmm.
right? He came from England to Mexico to open up businesses, and so they actually ended up in the United States after the Mexican Revolution. So half of my family was totally white, half of my family was half Italian and half Mexican, and on the other half were all Mexican, right? But my grandfather was red hair white from Spain. Okay, so and that is the reality of most of us.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
When it comes down to genetics, which I found really fascinating, I've done my own genetics. We're from all over the place. I mean, even in anthropology, we can go back to the pre-humans, right? And we have genetics of that.
Mhm.
And we have genetics from people in Africa that were black. So the color of our skin has nothing to do with our genetics, it has to do with our needs for protection in certain parts of the world. So you didn't need a lot of protection in the northern parts of the world, but you need a lot of protection from the sun in other parts of the world, right? So then the shades of our skin has nothing to do with privilege, but privilege ended up being connected with the color of the skin, right? And that is very dangerous, and we're still seeing it after all this year, right? So it creates a kind of a mixture of biological, socio-political, cultural mess, right? That is very easy for us to say there's nothing we can do about it,
Mm.
right? And I can tell you because you know history, how many people have died because of all of this, right? So the question is, how do we deal, right, with having to confront the consequences of whiteness, not only in terms of rejection of those who are not white, but the lack of self-esteem and self-image in those who are white, that all they have is whiteness,
Mm.
right? That you remove the idea of whiteness for them, they have nothing left. They don't know who they are except that they're white.
And does that tie back to what you've always say about individual values? People say, what's important about you? They'll talk about their achievements, what they've gained. And you're like, no, no, no. Are you loving? Are you caring? Is that kind of like the same thing? There's like a vacuum in their values, and so they latch on to the color of their skin and that cultural identity. To
Well, you see, I think that we were in the right path for a very long time on balancing ourselves, right? Meaning, what makes us valuable, what makes us um, humans.
Mhm.
And it's not the color of our skin, it's not our religion, it's our values, right? Our ability to be caring and loving and kind and industrious and productive. And so the fact that we have the values makes us valuable. Okay. The problem actually is really fascinating to see the evolution since the advent of the internet and then social media. And that is because social media and the advent of the internet facilitates the fast dissemination of extremes, right? So it wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s that we started seeing all of this reflourishing of extremes, right? Because we actually forgot our values, forgot our value, and decided that we're going to follow the flashy lights, right? So if it gives me likes, I like it, right? It doesn't matter what I believe. It's just you fall into that trap. And I find it really fascinating and encouraging because I was talking to my 20-year-old daughter who's in college in San Diego about this particular issue. And I heard some things from her that were kind of like a flash of freshness about her generation, right?
Yeah.
Because she was telling me that we have this misconception, okay, that they are all into social media.
Hmm.
I really found it fascinating to hear that they're actually moving away from it,
Yep.
right? I mean, those generations, like my oldest daughter and my second daughter, who are probably more in the middle in between those generations, probably fell more into that trap of extreme. But we're starting to find younger generation that I think are going to have a big impact on advocating for inclusivity, advocating for policy change, amplifying the voices of marginalized people outside of the idea of quick response, right? So she was talking about taking breaks from social media,
Hmm.
communicating verbally, socializing in person, you know. Uh, and she was actually a little upset with me because I was kind of being critical of social media without taking into consideration how people who are between 17 and 21 right now are looking at the world. And it's very different than what other generations have seen. And I find that really encouraging. I also
Yeah.
find very, very encouraging that younger people are getting interested in social change.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tool, right? And just because the first people who got a hold of it didn't necessarily use it properly. And I agree with you. My stepdaughter, I listened to her speak, and she doesn't care if you're white, black, yellow. She doesn't care. She has friends from all over the place. She just doesn't care. If you're a good person, you're a good person. Their usage of social media is with knowledge of that it's algorithm driven. It's designed to elicit a response. They're using it for their own interpersonal communications, but kind of ignoring the rest of it. And I agree. There seems to be some, I think, some wonderful benefit to it. And I think you're right. It's going to have some changes. But the question I have is, we have these people a little bit older, my age and stuff like that, who are convinced uh, that they're either a under assault because of their whiteness, or that the white privilege concept doesn't exist at all. Now I know you and I both have had these experiences. I have for sure benefited from my skin tone, 100%. Right, but I've also been prejudiced against because of my last name. And
Mhm.
I've had that happen. So to me, it's like, yes, it does exist. It may not be as systemic as some people think, but it does exist. What do you say to those people who deny the fact that's a reality?
More than what we say is how we listen to them, right? Because what happens is that when we start, and I have dealt with this personally, because I come from a small medical school university in Mexico. I had to fight twice as hard to come into the United States, taking exams, having to deal with what I call, now actually writing a blog about this, uh, the narcissistic academic privilege in the United States. If you're not from that environment, then you don't belong. So I've been smart enough to utilize that in a paradoxical way in my benefit, right? But to do that, people don't realize that those of us who have had to deal with rejection, had to deal with being rejected from schools and in residency programs and things of that sort, you have to learn to work harder, and that you have to learn to do what other people don't want to do, right? But that's no different than the migrant worker. I mean, for me as a physician, I had to deal with migrant workers do at a different level, meaning, I mean, most white privileged people don't want to go and pick up cotton, or they don't want to go and pick up tomatoes, and they don't want to go to California and pick up avocados, right? So, from that perspective, those of us who don't enjoy the privilege, right, either because we come from a different country or our skin is different, then we have to work harder, right? The problem is that they don't understand that that creates some resentment. I mean, for me to be a psychiatrist, I had to learn to deal with that, right? I had to train myself to not be resentful, but to be understanding that whiteness may be perceived as a privilege, but it's a horrible weakness, right?
Mhm.
It's a horrible weakness because you have to be constantly defended. And it's very difficult to defend because it has no logic,
Yeah, there's
right?
no basis in it
There's
whatsoever.
no there's no factual basis for it except I'm white and you're not. Okay,
How much
so
melatonin's in your skin or whatever? Melanin,
exactly.
excuse
So
me, melanin, right?
so from that perspective, what I've learned to do, and I don't think that this will necessarily work for everybody, what I have learned to do is to listen more and talk less, right? Because what I'm thinking is, if you are pushing me away, it's probably because you want me to react to that. It
Mhm.
is probably because you want me to defend me. Okay. And that is the projection of your insecurity. You're so insecure about your whiteness that you want me to be insecure about myself, so I defend myself. So the first thing that I do is never ever defend yourself. The moment that you're starting to defend you, you're going to be forced to show us your own insecurities, and you're going to have to be defensive. Okay, about what? Do I have to defend the fact that my skin is a little brown? Do I have to defend the fact that my eyes are in blue? No, I don't. So the best way to defend against racism is to not have self-doubt, and that takes time, right? So I see it all the time. The kids are constantly defending themselves. And that was part of the problem with social media and with the internet, in that a lot of people feel they had to defend themselves.
Mm.
Okay, somebody put a post, you feel offended, then you retaliate, right? And that moves people to the extremes. So, I mean, when I see things like that, and I was actually in a prison today interviewing
Mm.
a person with, he's in death row, right? So I was interviewing him, and his last name is Hispanic, but he's very white, right? And we spoke in English and all that. But what I found really fascinating is that in these kinds of situations, right, you have to be able to not feel insecure what you're doing and not feel the need to defend yourself, right? So that takes practice and practice and practice.
So, for some people who are white, what's their side of it? What's their way to manage this curse?
I think that they need to understand that being white does give them some privileges, and
Accept
they
the
shouldn't,
realities of it.
yeah, and they shouldn't abuse it.
Mm.
Okay, they shouldn't use it as a shield from allowing themselves to know other people. Part of the problem with whiteness is that it becomes like a protection in which you don't feel a need to allow anybody else in, right? And that's how racism starts, right? And the best way that somebody who's white can learn, okay, is to listen. And I have to tell you, I mean, most white people in the United States are very inclusive,
Yeah, very much so.
right? So I'm not talking about the majority of white people. I'm talking about those who perceive whiteness as a cult. Most white people that I know, and I treat a lot of them every day, okay, I can have a wonderful conversation in which their whiteness is not a resistance, okay, my brownness is not a resistance in any way, because I have learned to allow them in, right? Give them a little bit of me so they
Mm.
can see my humanity, not my brownness, right? So for anybody who is in a cult of insecurity and that they prefer whiteness, okay, over anything else, including being poor, right? And I have to say, in the United States of America, most poor people are white.
Mhm.
They're not brown, they're not Oriental, they're not Muslim, right? They're white. The most expensive people in the United States in terms of welfare
All right.
and Medicaid are white.
Mhm.
Okay. So the question is, why? Why do you stay there? Right? Why are you so afraid of walking away from whiteness, you know, into growth, into understanding, into learning, right? Because the perpetuation of insecurity and the perpetuations of ignorance, okay, it's not good for this country.
Oh, it's a higher cost than anything else.
I mean, I did not, and I find it fascinating. For example, in math or in science or engineering, especially when it has to do with computers, who own those businesses? Who are the ones running and providing the intellectual input to all this? They're not white people.
Mhm.
They're people from other parts of the country, and we keep importing them because they're good for the economy, right? Um, so we need to be able to humble ourselves to the idea, as radical as it sounds, that we're all the same.
Yep.
I mean, it's not. As I told my students and personnel in the hospital, it's not rocket science.
Yeah.
I mean, you can try to make it as intellectual as you want, but it's not. You know.
Again, judge
Uh,
people as humans first. Everything else is just, like I said, a bunch of DNA strung together to make some perception of the human being.
yeah, you
Tall,
know,
short, round, black, white, yellow. It's strands of it's protein stocking DNA. That's it.
and I have to tell you, I mean, and I found this the worst contradiction in the history of humanity, especially for white Christian people. Jesus Christ was brown.
Yeah. Yes, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus could not have occurred.
No,
Like literally could not have occurred.
come on.
Yeah.
What would Jesus do?
Yep.
I mean, what? When did Christians forget that? What would Jesus do?
Well, I think what you said it earlier. It's when it was appropriated as something to control and to get a group of people together. So first to bring them together, and then to control them and bind them together with this identity, instead of transcending that with, quite frankly, the teachings of that man, of Jesus Christ, versus anything else. It's religion, as you said, religion and race for sure have been manipulated by the larger powers to control, divide, and anger the masses instead of us transcending that. And I when you said earlier about the internet, I think once people realize, especially this next generation, that they have power, they can make those decisions. You
You
know,
know, I really, I know we're going to stop in a couple of minutes, but I just want to say, I've been really encouraged since the Dobbs decision on abortion in the United States with the Supreme Court. The reactions in Kansas, in Ohio, Wisconsin, you know, and you know who's leading that? Young people.
yep,
If
absolutely,
they think is, I mean, if there is a group of people that we need to be afraid of in terms of their political power, and there's a lot of movement to keep them from voting, okay, is those 18 to 25.
yep, they have
Those
the power.
they have the power. There are a lot of them, and there's more turning. So I'm really optimistic about the future, and I'm very optimistic that um, we need to find a middle ground about this.
I agree. I'm optimistic as well. Talking to young people, and hopefully this potential curse of whiteness can be something that people can accept and do the work. Like you said, learn how to listen, learn how to be less secure or insecure, and to be accepting. I heard a guy say recently, he goes, "Well, you need to be colorblind," and another guy says, "No, you need to not be colorblind, but you have to ignore the fact that color makes a difference in anything."
Exactly. I mean, color shouldn't be a component of judgment about people. Values should be.
Absolutely. Well, once again, Doctor, thank you very much for your time, your words. Everybody like, subscribe, and share, and check out those ebooks. And we'll talk to you all again, hopefully, next week.
Ah, thank you, Vince. See you soon.